Hello and welcome to Great Lives, where I have with me Jeremy Vine, ex-Newsnight, once a brilliant BBC Southern Africa correspondent, but who probably reached his biggest audience when, not so very long ago, he took over the Jimmy Young Show on Radio 2, a move which seems to have gone swimmingly from day one. Today we explore another side of Jeremy, which I would not have guessed, because he turns out to be a bit of a poet and a poetry lover. Jeremy, who have you chosen as your great life?
I've chosen WH Auden.
Why?
Well, I went to university to study English literature in the early 80s, Matthew, and when I arrived, my idea of poetry was Shakespeare's sonnets and Wordsworth, and I thought poetry was a very soppy and fluffy thing. And I said something which I can't really believe I said now to my tutor at Durham. I said, I don't really like poetry. And instead of sending me back to Surrey, he sent me away for a week with a book of Auden poems and said, come back in a week and tell me that again if you really don't like it. And I read in Auden in that week a totally different approach to poetry. The tone, the precision, the facility with language, the total unfluffiness. And I've been reading him ever since.
Our imported expert today is Richard Davenport-Hines, who's written the definitive literary biography of Auden, though he's quick to insist that he relied heavily on a biography written by a former presenter of this programme, the late Humphrey Carpenter. Richard, the irony for all Auden biographers, and maybe for us in this studio today, is that Auden himself disapproved of literary biography. Listen to this.
I'm very much against it because artists are not men of action, they're people who make things. Therefore, what is important is what they make. Now, it's true that all poems, in some sense, are derived from the poet's personal experience. But it becomes transmuted, and nothing you could find out about his personal life will help you to understand the poems, in my opinion. And I object terribly to this kind of way in which it's claimed it's scholarship, but in fact it's nothing more or less than gossip writing.
Well, that rules you out completely, Richard, doesn't it? renders one of your life's works completely pointless.
Oh, it probably was from the word go.
Do you think he really disapproved?
Well, he was frightened of what biographers would say about him and frightened that his vocation would somehow be reduced by them. But he had a passionate love of gossip himself. He loved reading literary biographies, and he was particularly keen on the juicy, sexy bits.
Is it true of Auden that we can't learn much that matters about his poetry by talking about his life?
Oh, it's absolute nonsense. He was a man who was poetic career mirrored the intellectual history of the 20th century. He got enormous fads and crazes for different intellectual things, psychoanalysis, Marxism, theology, and the whole poetic canon reflects that.
Well, I mean, that's a shocker for me because I have loved his poetry without knowing anything about his life. And I always find that the worst thing you can possibly do is to find out about the life of an artist, because once you put it in context, it seems to me to start losing its value.
Doesn't it make you curious to know about the man? You've just said that these things don't help, but there you've got Richard's biography in front of you. I can see that it's heavily thumbed, annotated in the margins. Looks as though you've read it many times. Are you wasting your time?
I've read it twice, and I enjoyed it very much. And I read it the first time 5 years ago. I actually read it in Africa. But I think the crucial thing about Auden is he knew exactly what he was doing with his pen. He didn't need my pen or Richard's pen to help him. The poem I love the most is called The Watershed. It starts, who stands the crux left of the watershed, below him sees, chafing floors, snatches of tram line running to a wood, an industry already comatose, yet sparsely living. An engine at Cashwell raises water. For years it lay in flooded workings until this, its latter office, grudgingly performed. So he's giving you a sketch of this wasteland, this place where everything's ruined. And then he begins to take you into the lives of the people who've died underground there. And then you get the picture of this young man, rather cocky young man who's arrived in his Porsche, I imagine, who's standing and in a rather arrogant way surveying this place and feeling that he owns it. And then Auden says, and this is one of his crackerjack lines, new paragraph, return button, Go home, stranger, proud of your young stock. Stranger, turn back, frustrate and vexed. This land cut off will not communicate. Be no accessory content to one aimless for faces rather there than here. And now the great line for journalist Matthew is coming up. Beams from your car may cross a bedroom wall. They wake no sleeper. So the young man, just like you and me as reporters, whistles in his fast car, the headlights flash across the bedroom walls of the people who live there, and he thinks he owns it, and they don't even wake up. And I felt, for me, on the road as a television reporter particularly, because literally we have the headlight on the front of the camera, that's what we did on our worst days. That's all we did. We went through with a camera, we went across the bedroom walls, and we went out again. And for me, that poem is the absolute indictment of the worst kind of journalism.
I'm going to return to the life, whether you like it or not, Jeremy. Here's Christopher Isherwood, who was actually at prep school with WH Auden and says this: he was precociously clever, untidy, lazy, and with the masters inclined to be insolent. His ambition was to be a mining engineer, and his playbox was full of thick scientific books on geology and metals and machines. His father was a doctor, and to several of us, including myself, he confided the first naughty, stupendous, breathtaking hints about the facts of sex. With his hinted forbidden knowledge and stock of mispronounced scientific words portentously uttered, he enjoyed among us, his semi-savage, credulous schoolfellows, the status of a kind of witch doctor. Doesn't that tell you something about the man and his work?
I'm interested to know that. I'm interested because having read Richard's book, I realised that in tandem with this sense of the brooding doom of the Second World War that was coming, where he read his best poetry, I think goes absolutely locked in with his own sexual repression and his personal difficulties there. So it's interesting to me that that's the case. But all the colour of Auden's life, I sort of feel you need to sift out. There's a great story in Richard's book about how one of Auden's friends are getting into a terrible sort of love argument, and this man goes off and gets so depressed that he shoots himself through the head and misses his brain.
This is a true story.
True story.
Yes.
So he ends up with a bullet lodged, you'll know exactly where, Richard, somewhere.
He shoots himself in the forehead, which is a disastrous place to shoot yourself if you're trying to kill yourself, because it doesn't hit anything quite often.
I didn't know that, so that's obviously useful information for me. But so he comes back to Auden for help, having shot himself in the head, right? And then you record how Auden makes a record of the night, and he says, we went to hospital and there was an appropriate snowstorm. And the word appropriate is such an Auden word. Appropriate is his word. Necessary is his word. He loves to give you everything weighted just about right. It's so funny when he writes his epitaph on W.B. Yeats, who of course is the totally opposite kind of poet. W.B. Yeats, wonderful poet, the magical, mysterious, flowery sort of poetry. And Auden can't quite appreciate Yeats in the way that Yeats would have appreciated him. So he writes, all the instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So as if to feel the emotion, Auden needs to look at a thermometer.
Yes, and that's why I, a little bit of an Auden sceptic, don't always catch the spirit of the thing. Like the geology of which he was so fond, I feel that he does tell you about all the layers of rock of which a hill is composed in beautiful prose, but not always giving you quite the feeling of the beauty of the hill.
I really want to convert you, Matthew. I really want to convert you, because in Richard's book, he talks about how Auden looked at this particular massacre there'd been in 1942 in Czechoslovakia in Lidice. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
And this produced what Auden called a mass of versified trash, the kind of poetry you love, Matthew, of people trying to express the sort of awfulness of this massacre in lots of ghastly, verbose poems with loads and loads of adjectives and nonsense. And Auden makes the point that the only way you can really, really express the horror of what happened in that place is to write about how, having read the reports, you carried on with your breakfast. And isn't that absolutely at the heart of where we are? Isn't that the best way of saying it?
You're proving to me why one needs some sort of biographical context, because I think that poem, which is absolutely superb, it's also pretty hard to understand what's happening in it unless you know the background. When he's a political poet in the 30s, he gets absolutely obsessed by the way people rather casually walk past and don't notice immense human suffering. He went in 1936 to Iceland with Louis MacNeice, and saw a whale. He was in love with whales, and he saw a whale being torn apart by mechanical winches while everyone sat around and smoked and made fried eggs. And this was for him as a vision of human indifference to violence.
You're listening to Great Lives on BBC Radio 4. I'm Matthew Parris. My expert witness is Richard Davenport-Hines, WH Auden's biographer. And it's Jeremy Vine, my special guest, who's chosen Auden as his great life. At school, on a walk, he had a sort of eureka moment. He was out one Sunday with Robert Medley, a boy 2 years older than him. Medley made some irreligious remark which annoyed Auden intensely. Medley changed the subject. Says Auden, kicking a little stone, he turned to me and said, "Tell me, do you write poetry?" "I never had," says Auden, and said so, but I knew that very moment that I wished to. Now, you, Richard, say that it was appropriate that Medley had been talking of Christianity only moments before Auden's life vocation was revealed. For, you say, Christians and poets share an analogical sense of the world and rely on a similar inheritance of symbolic language. I can almost put the word discuss on an A-level paper after that. But you, Jeremy, are a Christian too. Did you have any sort of eureka moment?
Yeah, I had a eureka moment with faith. I was brought up in a very Christian household. I never really got into it. I then had a big bang moment after university, and then, life intrudes and you end up feeling you're struggling to be converted again.
How did it happen, the big bang moment?
I just said a prayer I meant, and I felt a sense of spiritual enlightenment and contact with God that I hadn't felt before, and maybe a sense of release, from constantly worrying, like Auden constantly worrying that he's not the person he wants to be, or he's not got the religion he thinks he should have, and so on. We're all struggling to be something, aren't we? And I think this poet he's writing about his own sexual, religious struggles in lots of other ways.
His sexual struggles carried on for quite some time. He went on to Oxford, and freed from constraints at public school, he celebrated his arrival with an eruption of sexual activity. I think exclusively homosexual. He had to pay £5 to a blackmailer who found him in bed with John Betjeman. And at times during his life he did have dalliances with women. But I think, Richard, that we could call him almost exclusively gay, couldn't we?
Queer, I think. A gay would be quite the wrong
Yes,
word in
that's
every
what it
possible
was,
way.
yeah.
And he's certainly not a gay icon as his friend Christopher Isherwood became.
Yes,
although
he got
based on
rather
about his own.
disapproving of campaigning homosexual reformers as well. His contribution to the debate in Britain about the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the 60s was, as a homosexual nearing 60 years of age, I wish the speakers on both sides knew more what they were talking about. To begin with, they seem unaware that for over 99% of us, it makes not the slightest difference, so far as our personal liberty is concerned, whether such a law be on the statute book or not. I detest that point of view. I encountered it a lot when I was campaigning in the same way in Parliament, and you met these old gay men, old queens, quite a lot of them, who'd sorted their own lives out. They had no problem with the law, they had no problem with the police, and appeared to have forgotten how miserable they were in youth and how miserable a lot of other people were in youth, and that the law did matter and that public attitudes did matter. And it shocks me that Auden could have been so callous.
Do you know what? I'm just realising something, that the reason I have resisted biography is because I wouldn't like this guy. And the more I know about his life, and what you've just said there, Matthew, the more I think, if I don't like him, I might go off his poetry.
But it's very clear, Jimmy, what you really adore and really have a great sympathy with is the English Auden before he goes to the United States in 1939, who's a very political poet, who's a young, eager, thin, hopeful young man, and is also very provincial. He never lives in London at any stage in his life.
I think that puts him down a bit, because what he was dealing with from 1929 to 1939 is the biggest news story of the last 100 years, which is that the whole world was about to go into a second world conflagration and no one had spotted it. And he saw it, as a poet, he saw it coming. And we had reference after reference after reference where he wonderfully portrays that sense of oncoming doom. And what the disaster is, look at the First World War, look at the poets we had, Owen and Sassoon and Rosenberg and those great people. Who did we have in the Second World War? Answer, I can't think of any. Where was he? He was in America. That was it. It was a disastrous career move.
Oh, but he goes to the United States.
He went in 1939, didn't he?
He went in 1939
Funny
because
that.
he was disgusted by being a wonderful public speaker, doing fairly demagogic things which felt absolutely forced to him. And certainly at the period that I find so exciting about him is Greenwich Village in the late 1940s. It's like Paris in 1920. He's whizzing along on Benzedrine all the time. He's writing about existentialism and is a thrilling new person.
No, but
A New Yorker.
It's really interesting you say that, just because my reaction to what you say is so fascinating, because I'm alarmed that you have taken out of your appreciation of Auden this massive gap, moral gap, in his life.
Before you go any further, let's just listen to this on that decision to go.
It's always difficult to know at the moment exactly why one does things. Looking back, I would say roughly that I felt the situation for me in England was becoming impossible. I couldn't grow up. That English life, which is marvellous in a way, but it is for me a family life. And I love my family, but I don't want to live with them.
You wanted to be alone, really?
Yes.
There's been a tremendous amount of criticism which continues to this day of your decision.
Naturally.
Impertinent criticism, I would agree with you. But
People have every right to make
But
it.
in a way, a criticism that you might care to answer.
No, I won't answer that kind of thing. I mean, I know that it was right for me to do. And in fact, I only felt that I discovered who I was after I got to America.
Have you ever had any regrets?
None.
The question that he won't answer, or the criticism he won't answer, Richard, is that he went to America because he didn't want to fight, I suppose, is it?
Oh, I don't think he thought in those terms at all. He was an extraordinarily driven poet who had decided, as you've told us, that he had a vocation to be a poet, and he went there because it's where he thought he'd write the best poetry next.
And he wrote really bad poetry for him.
And then he went through an absolutely dreadful spell after going to the United States, in my opinion. His poetry just frightful for 3 or 4 years.
He lost content. He had nothing to write about.
He did. Christianity, he found an extraordinarily preachy, pompous and disagreeable, rather self-glorifying form of Christianity.
Well, he was busy with that while the rest of the world was fighting
But come
for
on,
their
gentlemen.
countries and their lives.
For a moment, just back to this question of fighting. You say, Richard, it wouldn't have occurred to him that people would think he'd gone to America because he didn't want to fight. But I mean, here was Europe on the verge of the Second World War, facing some kind of darkness. Here was his country in huge difficulty, beleaguered, and most men of his age were going to be called up to fight. You honestly telling us that the question of whether he wanted to or didn't want to do it didn't help inform the decision to go to America?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. The previous year, he'd been essentially a war correspondent in the Far East, and there's a good deal of independent report that he wasn't frightened in dangerous situations or under fire. It wasn't gutlessness. I think it was a political naivety in a sense that was where his poetic future lay.
I wouldn't want to accuse this guy of gutlessness. I don't know him. But it seems to me he probably had a rather technical approach to morality. For all the reasons his poetry is great, he thinks a lot about little details, were all the reasons he didn't see the obvious truth, which is that he needed to stay. And can I just read Consider, which is where he's starting to see all the rumbling and everything else. And just this is such an amazing thought at the end of this poem. Seekers after happiness, all who follow the convolutions of your simple wish, it is later than you think. That's a warning. And in the end, he sought the happiness himself.
Let's just listen to a poem he wrote shortly after arriving in the United States in 1939. It's called The 1st of September 1939, and these extracts are read by Jack Davenport.
I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odour of death offends the September night. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenceless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame.
Richard, he repudiated the poem September 1939, or in particular the line, "We must love one another or die."
Because it isn't true. He said we must love one another and die, which is what he changed the line to.
It's quite a big change. You see, I think the muddle started with that poem. I mean, you could just hear him starting to lose it. As you listen to that, you think, this guy doesn't know what he's doing there.
The trouble was that he was always the most terrible spiritual masochist. He gave himself a very hard time, an unnecessarily hard time in his sex life, in his emotional life, in all his living arrangements, and he punished himself dreadfully, and then he started punishing his poems too.
Is he interesting or useful as a political commentator?
He's a whistleblower, really, I think. He's trying to show us things that don't work properly, and that includes matters of the human heart. I mean, it's funny, the other year, wasn't it, Four Weddings and a Funeral came out, and they have the funeral scene, and it's one man grieving for another man, isn't it? And he reads, and it's brilliant, all credit to the film's producers. They get him to read "Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone." Now, that's a lovely little part of a bigger poem written later in his career. So there are chinks of light, later after Auden left England. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. We know it all, back to front, off by heart. As a result of that, about 10 years ago when the film came out, there's an Auden sensation. So I was so cross about it. Yes. Suddenly everybody wants a piece of him. I then go into a bookshop and there's Auden's greatest poems. It's like, next to the ABBA's greatest hits CD, and it's "Stop All the Clocks" is the first one, and then there's "Night Mail," which I don't really like. Lots of sing-songy poems. Once he starts to rhyme and do rhythm, it all falls apart for me. And I suddenly thought, this person who's been my sort of private joy of reading for a long time, everyone now owns him completely. I wonder how he'd feel about that.
But that "Stop All the Clocks" was meant to be a parody, wasn't it? Or what was it?
I just take everything at face value. I obviously didn't pick that up.
It's the kind of thing you might see on a roadside shrine with flowers.
No. It's clever. The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean. Sweep up the wood. For nothing now can ever come to any good. Matthew, that's brilliant. Come on.
No, it's dreadful.
If you'd written it, I'd say it was good.
No, you wouldn't. Well, I hope not.
It had originally been written to be sung as a nightclub song by Louis MacNeice's girlfriend, and it was camp and sending up in its original composition, like so much that he did then. I think it's rather fun.
How interesting. So the filmmakers fell for that, and I did too. So the joke's on me here. I thought it was a good poem. I come on the radio to praise this guy's work 100 years later. I discover I'm praising a poem which he only put in to catch out people who don't know poetry.
No, when I said parody, I didn't mean that he wanted us to think it was awful, but that he was aping a particular style. That doesn't mean he didn't have anything to say. Let's move to post-war. Auden comes back. What did he do when he came back?
He came back in the mid-1950s for 3 or 4 years as Professor of Poetry at Oxford from about 1956.
Was he any use at Oxford, though? Who were his audience?
He was giving a whole series of lectures on writing and reading poetry, but he also read the amateur poetry of any undergraduate who wanted to come and see him. And he was very edgy when he came back to England because of all the hostility to him for having gone abroad during the war, because also F.R. Leavis and a lot of the critical establishment were very heavily ganging up against him in code about his sexuality, giving him a very hard time.
And the student, you see, I sort of imagine myself just if it was a 1 in a million and I could go back and live again at a different date and roughly the same country, I think I'd want to be sitting in there at his lectures. And then he used to go and have tea. You tell me about this. He'd have tea once a week, and students could come and show him their poetry, is that right?
Yes, or read their poetry to him, which is what he really liked, because poetry is a thing to be read aloud. He very much believed.
Would you have done that, Jeremy? Would you have gone along and read one of your poems?
I think it would be such a great story afterwards. You'd have to do it, wouldn't you? However, but
Go
I just
on.
imagine.
What would you have read? What would you have read? Give us.
Well, Matthew, come on. I mean, we all write bad poetry. I mean, I
Imagine that I am WH Auden. This is your moment.
Okay, so I say to him, Whiston, I'm really sorry to bother you, but it's Jeremy, one of your students here, and I've written something, and it's just a few lines long. Is there any chance that I could read it to you? And he says, yes, have some tea first. I sit down, I'm on the cushions in the coffee bar, whatever it is, and I read, and I noted this down because I wrote it at least 20 years ago. Death comes quickly to those who lose love. Days are games on a floodlit golf range, with every putt picked out by the lamps. Weeks are battered jeeps bouncing on ramps. Years are careers which demand you act tough. Death comes quickly to those who lose love.
I think that's rather estimable.
It sounds sincere. Anyway,
It's true at the time. I can't remember who had lost, but it was... Anyway, so what would he say? That's the question, because I don't think he probably liked anybody's poetry but his own.
Might have rather depended if you were a very good-looking young man who'd come along to.
Well, he wouldn't have liked it then.
Was he predatory, Richard?
he made himself as unhappy as possible in as many possible occasions as possible, both sexually and in other ways. He had a 30-year involvement with a man called Chester Coleman, who was a beast to him, utterly humiliated him, made him totally miserable.
I love the way we're just about to discuss what Auden would think of my poem, and Matthew's gone straight for the sex. That's all we want to know. Would he have tried to grope me under the table? That's all we're interested in here.
What we haven't really mentioned at all is how all his life long from childhood he had an absolutely excruciating sense of personal isolation. He really, really, really felt acutely lonely in ways that I can't get my head round at all. I think he sought out unhappiness because he thought it made him more creatively exciting, more enriching.
And you, Jeremy, feel grateful to him as, in a sense, the man, the voice who turned you on to poetry.
Well, very much so. And I mentioned him as a whistleblower, which he was in the 30s when he was writing. But for me, I think he's pointed a lot of things out. He's given us a map for the human heart, and it's very, very accurate.
And this is why I love the very final 10 years of his work, when he's an older man, finding reconciliation, finding some sort of meaning, calming down, finding great pleasure in very domestic, ordinary things like installing a new kitchen in his house. And
Jeremy would say that doesn't matter. My thanks to my guest, Jeremy Vine, who chose as his great life the poet W.H. Auden, and to Auden's biographer, Richard Davenport-Hines, who joined us. Goodbye.